see a 10% levy slapped onto goods.
Report here for Donald.
Happen quickly.
Lynn Stefanchuk says
Canadian exports will be exempt.
Dozens of countries around the world do this.
The United States is threatening fresh tariffs on Canada because of wildfire smoke drifting south across the border. On Saturday, July 25th, he shared an image on social media showing the Canada and United States border divided by an air filter, a day after telling reporters that a large tariff was coming because of the smoke. That threat lands on top of something far more concrete. A 50% levy on a long list of Canadian goods announced earlier this week and scheduled to take effect on August 19th.
First feature-length movie that was shot from start to finish, every scene with an IMAX film camera.
Regina's Kramer IMAX Theater at the Saskatchewan Science.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says all options remain on the table. What is not yet clear is whether anyone is actually talking. I want to begin with what changed in the last 48 hours because the sequence matters. On Friday, July 24th, the president told reporters that his administration would impose a significant tariff on Canada over the smoke, saying that Canada has to do something about it and adding that the United States has never had this problem before. His exact words were blunt. He said, "We're going to put a big tariff on Canada because of the smoke." Then, on Saturday, he escalated the message visually rather than verbally, posting the air filter image online. That is the full extent of the smoke-related threat as it currently stands.
Film format, but there are only a few theaters that can show it. As CTV's Allison Bamford tells us, one happens to be in Saskatchewan.
And that is an important qualification, so let me be precise about it. As of this report, there is no published order, no listed rate, no named product category, and no stated legal mechanism attached to the smoke justification. Officials have not confirmed how such a measure would be structured, which American agency would administer it, or how the volume of drifting smoke would be measured against a schedule of tariffs. It has been announced as an intention by the president in public remarks and on social media. It has not been issued as policy. Those are two very different things, and the difference will matter enormously to Canadian exporters in the weeks ahead. The measure that already exists is the one with a date attached to it. On Monday, July 20th, the American administration announced new levies of 50% on a long list of goods coming from Canada. The stated reasons had nothing to do with wildfires. According to the administration, the levies were a response to two separate irritants: decisions by several Canadian provinces to pull American alcohol from government-run liquor shelves and Canada's supply-managed dairy industry. Those tariffs are set to come into force on August 19th, which gives Ottawa slightly more than 3 weeks. So the week began with tariff threats and ended with tariff threats, but the justifications changed along the way. That shifting rationale is one of the central puzzles in this story. A trade measure aimed at liquor retaliation is a dispute over commercial policy. A trade measure aimed at dairy pricing is a dispute over decades-old agricultural rules. A trade measure aimed at wildfire smoke is something else entirely, because it is directed at a natural event that no government controls.
Massive blaze. Officials warn that tonight will be a difficult one because the winds have turned against them. The final stage of the...
Understanding why all three arguments are being made in the same 7-day stretch is the key to reading what may actually be happening here. Before I get to that, let me explain the dairy issue in plain terms, because it comes up constantly, and it is rarely explained clearly. Canada's supply management system covers dairy, poultry, and eggs. It limits how much farmers produce, sets prices at the farm gate, and restricts imports beyond agreed quota levels. Supporters argue it gives Canadian producers stable incomes and shields consumers from wild price swing.
Are wrong. Obviously, they don't go in place until August 19th, and we need to see if there's room for negotiation in there. On top of that, the administration put a 10% tariff in place on Friday mornings.
American producers have long argued it locks them out of a market next door. This is one of the oldest running disagreements between the two countries, and it predates the current president by many years.
That there have been ongoing strikes between the two countries for the last several days. The American president has threatened to go even further, suggesting that
the liquor dispute is much newer and much more visible to ordinary shoppers. Several provinces stopped purchasing American liquor last year during an earlier round of trade friction, pulling bourbon and other American products from shelves in provinces where governments control alcohol distribution. Because those provincial liquor boards are among the largest single buyers of alcohol in North America, the decision had real commercial weight. It also had symbolic weight, which is part of why it drew attention in Washington. Alberta and Saskatchewan reversed course after a few months, and that split among provinces has now resurfaced. That brings me to Alberta, because the response inside Canada is not uniform. Premier Danielle Smith has said she is not planning to follow the lead of other provinces by keeping American liquor off store shelves. Rather than retaliate, she says she will leave the decision to retailers and to consumers, letting individual businesses and shoppers choose what they want to stock and buy. It is a deliberate departure from the approach taken elsewhere, and it reflects a genuine disagreement about whether countermeasures strengthen Canada's position or simply raise costs at home. Why does that matter beyond the liquor aisle? Because tariff disputes are negotiated by the federal government, but some of the most visible levers sit with the provinces. When provinces move together, Ottawa can present a single national position. When they diverge, the American side can point to that division. Neither Premier Smith nor the federal government has framed this as a rupture, and I want to be careful not to overstate it. But the practical effect is that Canada's retaliation toolkit is now partly a matter of provincial choice rather than national policy. The Prime Minister's own position has been stated in deliberately broad language. Mr. Carney says all options are on the table in response to the new American tariffs. In diplomatic terms, that phrase does real work. It signals that counter-tariffs, targeted measures, and other responses have not been ruled out while committing to nothing specific. It preserves flexibility ahead of a deadline. What it does not tell us is which option the government actually favors, or whether a negotiated outcome before August 19th is considered realistic inside Ottawa. Now I want to turn to a reading of these events that deserves serious attention, because it reframes the whole week. One international trade expert has suggested that the intensifying pressure from the president could actually be a signal that talks between the two countries are ramping up rather than breaking down.
Madrid. And here at home, residents of Clinton, BC are still out of their homes with fires nearby. We begin in Europe tonight with two countries in crisis.
The argument runs like this. When tariff threats escalate sharply, there is usually a reason behind the timing. In this view, Washington has been working through its trade files in sequence. Mexico's file is nearly complete with another meeting set for September, and Canada's turn has now arrived. I want to flag clearly that this is analysis, not confirmation. No government has announced a negotiating round, a venue, or a date for formal Canada and United States talks. The interpretation is that pressure is being applied as leverage ahead of discussions, which is a familiar pattern in trade disputes.
Julia Wong tells us it appears to be Trump's latest attempt to use tariffs to disrupt global trade.
This new tariff had been expected for quite.
It is a plausible reading of the sequence, and it comes from someone who studies these files closely. It is not an official statement from either capital, and it should not be treated as one. There is also a second track running quietly alongside all of this, and it received far less attention than the president's remarks. This week, Ottawa signed a new free trade agreement with Ecuador and concluded negotiations on a comprehensive economic partnership with the United Arab Emirates. Both moves fit the federal government's stated goal of trade diversification, the effort to reduce Canada's dependence on a single dominant export market. The logic is straightforward. If uncertainty over American trade policy persists, Canada looks for partners, investment, and revenue elsewhere. A word of caution on terminology, because these announcements are easy to misread. Signing an agreement and concluding negotiations are both meaningful steps, but neither is the same as an agreement being in force. Deals typically require legal review, translation, ratification, and implementing legislation before businesses can actually use the new terms. So these are real developments with real long-term potential, not immediate relief for an exporter facing a tariff on August 19th. Anyone hoping that new partnerships will offset near-term costs should understand that timeline. The diversification strategy is also being questioned inside Canada, and that criticism has two parts. Some critics argue that agreements with relatively small markets do not deliver the scale of diversification the Carney government has promised, given how much of Canada's trade flows south. Others have raised concerns about which governments Canada is willing to sign agreements with, saying the choice of partners raises difficult questions.
The Republicans are really digging their heels in. Tell us more about this major defense bill that the House passed in support of the war.
Right, and this is a yearly bill.
The government has framed these deals as part of a broader plan. The debate over whether that plan is sufficient remains unresolved. Let me come back to the wildfires themselves, because they are not a rhetorical device in this story. They are an active emergency, and the smoke at the center of the president's complaint comes from fires that Canadian crews are still fighting tonight. Residents of Clinton, British Columbia, remain out of their homes. The evacuation order came Friday afternoon, and the speed of it was remarkable. One resident described the town becoming completely uninhabitable within 5 or 6 hours of the order being issued. Local officials say most of the damage is concentrated in an industrial area. The fire has already passed through the village, but the situation east of Clinton is still active, which is why residents have not been allowed to return. That distinction matters for people watching from outside the province. A fire moving through a community does not mean the emergency is over. Crews continue to work in the surrounding area, and evacuation orders remain in place while conditions are assessed. For the families involved, the immediate question is not trade policy. It is when they will be able to go home. Clinton is not the only community on alert. The city of Kimberley is watching the nearby Matthew Creek wildfire closely, with local officials describing a level of anxiety and a need to stay flexible in case conditions shift. In the Fraser Canyon, cooler temperatures are expected to help moderate the Brunswick complex of fires, though the community of Boston Bar and nearby areas remain under evacuation orders. In response to the Ainsley Creek wildfire, 61 properties are under evacuation order and nearly 650 more are on evacuation alert. Those numbers explain something important about the tariff threat. Smoke crosses borders because air moves. No Canadian government department can reduce smoke output by administrative decision while fires are burning across mountain terrain. The president's remark that Canada has to do something about it does not identify what that something would be. Officials in Washington have not specified any technical or policy step Canada could take that would satisfy the demand, and no such requirement has been published. That gap is the reason the smoke argument is being read by many as leverage rather than as a literal environmental grievance. It is also worth noting that this fire season is not a Canadian phenomenon alone. Southern France and Spain are contending with fires that authorities there have described as unprecedented, with roughly 300,000 people forced to flee, France calling in military support, and Spain declaring a national emergency as 3 fires merged near Madrid. One death was reported in the coastal region of Valencia. I raise this not to draw a political conclusion, but because it provides essential context for any claim that large-scale wildfire smoke is a uniquely Canadian problem this summer. So what does the 50% tariff actually mean for people if it takes effect on August 19th? The honest answer is that the impact depends on which goods are covered, and the full effect will only become clear when the list is examined in detail. In general terms, a tariff of that size is not absorbed quietly. It raises the landed cost of affected products in the United States, which forces exporters, importers, and retailers to decide who pays. Some absorb it, some pass it on, and some lose the sale entirely. The exposure is not spread evenly across the country. Sectors that ship a large share of their output south, and small and medium-sized businesses without the margin to absorb a sudden cost increase are the most sensitive. Border communities where supply chains run back and forth daily feel disruption faster than inland regions. Provincial governments with concentrated export industries have more at stake in the outcome than others. This is precisely why the federal response has to balance competing regional interests, and why unified provincial positions are harder to achieve than they appear from the outside. There is also a cost that does not appear in any tariff schedule, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Uncertainty itself is expensive. When a threatened measure has a date but no final published detail, businesses cannot price contracts confidently, cannot commit to shipments months ahead, and cannot make investment decisions with any assurance about the rules. Some delay hiring, some pause expansion, some quietly look for buyers in other markets.
More on the numbers and why Canada is also facing a challenge.
This is an infection that still kills about 100,000 people on the planet every year.
For infectious diseases specialist, Dr.
Those decisions are difficult to reverse later, even if a tariff is eventually withdrawn or reduced. What I want to examine now is the question of retaliation, because it is the decision facing Ottawa in the coming week.
And essentially what we are to understand is that a deal was announced earlier this week by the U.S. Secretary of Energy to say that Saudi Arabia...
Counter tariffs are the traditional response, and Canada has used them before. They impose costs on the other side, which creates pressure to negotiate. But they also raise prices for Canadian buyers of the targeted goods, which is exactly the argument Premier Smith is making about alcohol. The government has not said which path it will take. All options remaining on the table means that choice has not been made public and possibly has not been finalized. That brings us to the timeline, which is the clearest thing in this entire story. August 19th is the date the announced 50% levies are scheduled to take effect. Between now and then, there are essentially three possible directions. An agreement or partial understanding could be reached that suspends or reduces the measures. The tariffs could take effect as announced, prompting a Canadian response, or the deadline could shift, as trade deadlines sometimes do. None of those outcomes has been confirmed, and each depends on decisions that have not yet been announced. The September meeting involving Mexico is worth keeping in view as well, for reasons of sequencing rather than substance. If the interpretation offered by trade analysts is correct, and Washington is working through its trade relationships one at a time, then the calendar itself becomes informative.
Alert in response to the Ainsley Creek wildfire. Now, the wafting smoke from Canadian wildfires is still aggravating the U.S. president.
A Canadian negotiating round beginning before that September date would support the theory that this week's pressure was preparatory. Silence through August would suggest something different. Either way, the pattern of scheduled meetings tells us more than the rhetoric does. Let me address a question I expect many viewers are asking directly. Can a country actually impose tariffs over wildfire smoke? The practical answer is that tariffs are legal instruments requiring a stated basis, and no basis has been published in this case. Trade measures are typically justified through defined categories such as security, injury to domestic industry, or response to another country's practices. Whether smoke could be fitted into any of those frameworks and whether such a measure would survive legal challenge is not something I can tell you tonight because no measure has been issued to examine. Here is a second question worth answering plainly. Is the smoke threat connected to the 50% tariffs or is it separate? Based on the stated reasons, they are distinct. The levies announced on Monday were attributed to the provincial liquor decisions and to dairy supply management. The smoke remarks came later in the week and were framed as an additional measure. Whether the two are eventually combined into a single package or whether the smoke comments remain rhetorical has not been clarified by the administration. I also want to be careful about a trap in stories like this one. It is tempting to assume that loud public statements automatically translate into policy, and it is equally tempting to assume they never do. Both assumptions have been wrong before. What the record shows in this case is that one set of threats has already produced a dated, announced measure with a specified rate, while another remains a verbal and social media declaration. Reporting the difference accurately is more useful than predicting which way it resolves. There is a broader political dimension here that I think explains part of the persistence. Critics of the approach argue that public opinion is not aligned with a sustained campaign against Canada, and that the framing of Canada as having treated the United States unfairly does not match the relationship as most people understand it. Supporters of the administration's approach would say pressure produces results at the negotiating table. Both views are being expressed publicly. What neither side disputes is that the relationship is under strain in a way that has now become routine rather than exceptional. For the Carney government, the pressure is genuinely two-sided, and that is the part I find most consequential. Externally, it faces a deadline and a counterpart that has escalated repeatedly through the week. Internally, it faces provinces with different appetites for retaliation, exporters seeking certainty, and critics questioning whether the diversification strategy is substantial enough to matter. Managing both at once on a 3-week clock is the actual task in front of Ottawa right now, and it is a considerably harder one than any single announcement suggests. So let me summarize what is confirmed and what is not, because the line between them has been blurred repeatedly this week. Confirmed, new levies of 50% on a long list of Canadian goods were announced on Monday, July 20th, with a scheduled start date of August 19th, attributed to provincial liquor decisions and dairy supply management. Confirmed, the president publicly threatened additional tariffs over wildfire smoke on Friday, July 24th, and posted the border and air filter image on Saturday, July 25th. Also confirmed, Mr. Carney has said all options are on the table. Premier Smith has declined to remove American liquor from Alberta shelves. Ottawa signed a trade agreement with Ecuador and concluded negotiations with the United Arab Emirates this week. And British Columbia continues to manage active wildfires with communities including Clinton and Boston Bar under evacuation orders. Not confirmed. Any legal instrument attached to the smoke threat, any scheduled Canada and United States negotiating round, any decision on Canadian retaliation, and any change to the August 19th date. What should you watch next? 3 things in order of significance. First, whether any formal document appears that gives the smoke justification legal shape, or whether it remains rhetorical. Second, whether the August 19th date holds, moves, or is superseded by talks. Third, whether provincial governments converge on a common position or continue to diverge, because that will shape how much leverage Ottawa can bring to any negotiation. Each of those developments would be a real change in the situation rather than another turn in the commentary.
Defense appropriations bill that is passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. This time around, it was really along party lines here, a $1.5 trillion budget from the House.
The reason this story deserves continued attention is not the rhetoric, it is the calendar. A specified tariff rate with a specified date is a measurable event with measurable consequences for workers, exporters, and consumers on both sides of the border.
To a narrow lane of the more than $400 billion of goods Canada ships to the U.S. Donald Trump appears to be reinforcing the tariff wall that was partly...
Everything else this week, the social media image, the remarks about smoke, the debate over liquor shelves, sits around that central fact. In 3 weeks, we will know whether August 19th became a turning point or a deadline that quietly passed while negotiators worked. Thank you for spending this time with me on the escalating tariff threats between Donald Trump and Canada and on what the August 19th deadline could mean for Canadian exporters, provincial governments, and shoppers on both sides of the border. This story is still moving, and the next official announcement from Washington or Ottawa could change it substantially. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you receive the verified updates as soon as the situation develops further.